It is an absolute delight to be with you this morning. We've been fighting COVID, so this is the first Sunday in 2 weeks that we've been able to be here, and just excited to be with you. If you're visiting with us, you have found the perfect church. I mean, the fruit of the Spirit just oozes out of each one of us 24/7. There is so much harmony here that even the present political situation can't disrupt our unity. There's never even an unkind thought in this group of folks here. We're just a pretty marvelous group. We're so good, in fact, the joy of just getting together this morning, there's not a single family here that's had an impatient word or just a frustrated thought as we got ready to come here to share worship together. We're so good that if a little bird had fallen out of a nest and one of us sees it, we'll stop whatever we're doing, find a ladder and return that bird. Yeah, you found the perfect church. Only problem is I'm reminded of the words of Groucho Marx. For you under 50, Groucho Marx was a very popular comedian from vaudeville in the early years of television. And he said once, I'm not sure I want to be a part of any group that will allow someone like me to be a member. No, as Jimmy said, we're not perfect. By the way, Jimmy, I really do like the jacket you had on this morning. Kind of similar. We're not perfect. We're just a group of people conscious of God who are trying to do the best we can to be like Jesus. And we're so grateful for God's grace. I've entitled my thoughts this morning.
You're good.
Not on?
You're good.
Okay. Thank you.
Here, turn your mic on.
Okay. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. I've entitled my thoughts this morning, Seeing with a Dead Man's Eye. I think that'd be a good title for a pirate movie. The genesis behind my sermon is that I was born with a defect in my right eye, and about 15 years ago, I started having real serious problems with my right eye, and my cornea just started deteriorating. And the day before the tornado outbreak in April 2011, I received the first of 3 different corneal transplants. And about a month and a half ago, the 6-year-old cornea that I currently have has started messing up and been really having a lot of problems. Last Tuesday at the ophthalmologist, I was able to read the top 2 lines of the eye chart with my right eye. But fortunately, my left eye, I can see 20/20. So if you're planning on sleeping during the sermon this morning, suggest you move over to the north side of the auditorium, because I can't see over there. So you can, David, you can get a good nap over there, because I won't see you unless I focus my left eye on you. Reality for me is that for me to see clearly out of my right eye, I have to see with a dead man's eye. I was able to find out with my first transplant that I received the cornea from a 51-year-old gentleman who died of colon cancer. And after the surgery and after some of the recovery, I was so amazed by the transformation that I was able to find out some information. And so I wrote a letter to the donor family and sent it to the Alabama Eye Bank, asking them to forward it to the donor family. But because of that, I've become real interested in the human eye. The human eye is so complex. It's so marvelous. And I'm not an expert by any means, so don't be confused by that. But for its size, the human eye is the most complex organ in the human body. It's slightly less than an inch in diameter, and weighs a little less than an ounce. And by the way, all human eyes are within a couple of millimeters of exactly the same size. But 80% of all information to the brain comes through our eyes. And our eyes can process 50,000 messages all simultaneously. When light comes into our eyes, and by the way, light is actually a very, very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but when light comes in to our eye, it comes in, and they're waves, and just like waves of the ocean coming into a small harbor, as those waves come into that harbor, they're diffused. Same thing happens in our eye. But regardless of that, it comes in and comes through the lens, and the lens focuses that light on the retina. Now, my problem is that the cornea, the outer protective side of the eye, my cornea is messing up. The cornea itself is less than a half a millimeter thick in the middle, and it's actually made up of 5 different layers. And they started transplanting corneas about a century ago. Now they're able to go in, for my part, it's just the outer part of the cornea, and they actually shave off the outer part of the cornea, take a donor cornea, shave off the same part, and then stitch it in. Just absolutely marvelous. But the light comes in, it's focused on the retina. The retina actually has 3 different types of cells, and the retina then translates those cells into electronic, it translates those light waves into electronic signals. And then those electronic signals interact with rods and cones. The rods take those signals and in a monochronial way adjust the light and all, and then the cones add color and detail to those images. There are, and I didn't count them, there are 130 million rods and 6 million cones in the human eye. And those who are a lot smarter than me said that for the cones and rods to work together, they're in exactly the perfect ratio to each other. And then the optic nerve translates these electronic impulses to the brain. Some have compared the eye to a camera. Well, yeah, kind of, except the fact that our eyes are able to process 10 million more photons, 10 million times more photons than what the very best camera today can work with. And that doesn't even begin. There's so many other things going on with the eye. There are muscles inside the eye that help the eye to contract and relax, that help you focus and distance and adjust to light. And then on the outside of the eye, there's actually 6 muscles. 2 muscles to help you move your eyes left and right, 2 muscles to help them go up and down, and then 2 muscles for you to roll your eyes. Imagine how bereft our teenagers would be if they weren't able to roll their eyes at their parents and teachers, right? And what's really neat about that is that the movement of the eye would actually make us dizzy and nauseated, but in the instantaneous nanosecond that it takes to move your eye, our eyes automatically turn off. So we don't sense the movement and thus don't get dizzy with it. And there's so many other things. Blinking, the way we automatically blink to watch our eyes. And that's not to say anything about how a young lady can just, with those eyes, she can just make a guy's heart just flutter. The eye is absolutely amazing. And it's not only just the eye itself, but it's also the environment in which we live. Larry Adams, a couple of months ago, put me onto this book from Michael Deaton. And it talks about how our environment that we live in is perfectly suited for us. He goes into detail talking about how the electromagnetic spectrum the light portion of it, which is only 1 times 10 to the 25th power of the entire spectrum, how that light comes in, and he has this quote talking about the eye. He says, given the immense range of wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum, only light has the right energy levels and the right wavelength for high acuity vision in an optical device the size of the human eye. It's absolutely marvelous the way it testifies to the creative ability of God. The psalmist was right when he said, great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them. Even the psalmist recognized, and the psalmist surely understood the work of God's hand in creating our eyes. Of course, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. And if you've had any problem with an eye, if you've ever gotten something in your eye or got poked in the eye, you know if you've got a problem with your eye, your whole body feels sick. And of course, Jesus being Jesus, he has a spiritual application to everything he talks about. Talking about the eye, Jesus is talking about spiritually the way that we see. Our goal is to see more clearly. And currently what I'm struggling with is to see more clearly with my right eye, physically. But our goal, and part of why we're here, is that we want to see more clearly spiritually. Jesus once told the story about an individual who died and was able to see more clearly with a dead man's eye. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In Luke chapter 16, at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's talking about money, and he's talking about unfaithfulness. And then he goes on, and he says to them, no servant can serve two masters. Either will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You can't serve two masters. And this is not a passage about having more than one wife, okay? You can't have two masters. You can't serve God and money. And then the next verse, Luke tells us that the Pharisees are there. He adds a little note, and he said, the Pharisees who love money. And the word that he uses there is kind of interesting. He uses the affectionate word for love, and he makes a compound word by putting the word silver with it. They really like silver, is what Luke's telling us. And they heard what Jesus was saying, and they sneered at him. The word means they actually lifted their nose to him. They put their nose in the air, what Jesus had to say. And then in the very next verse, Jesus, speaking directly to the Pharisees, he says, you're the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others. And he uses the word for which we get the word optic today. You try to justify yourselves in the eyes of others. But God knows your heart. And then he says, what people value highly is detestable, or in other translations, are abominable in God's sight. The word for detestable, abomination, is literally the Greek word for stinks, and they especially applied it to spoiled food. You want to know what God thinks of the things that we think are valuable? Well, after your trash can's been sitting in the sun for a couple of days, just go out and open it up and stick your head down in it. That's what God thinks of the things that we highly prize, that we think are so absolutely valuable. And then beginning in verse 19, Jesus starts to tell a story. And some people refer to this as a parable. Theologians are not quite sure because it doesn't quite follow the same format of most of Jesus' parables. he actually says there was a certain man in the original language. And that phraseology, it almost implies that these Pharisees know who he's talking about. There's a certain rich man, okay? We know who he is, who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. Purple cloth was very expensive. There was a shellfish in the Lycus River Valley of Asia Minor that made a dye that could transform cloth into this perfect purple color. Remember Lydia in the book of Acts? She was from Thyatira, which is in the Lycus River Valley, and she had a purple cloth business that she ran. And so this guy, he's able to buy his clothes from Asia Minor, where he can get this expensive cloth. And fine linen, okay, that was a polite way in that culture of saying he had fancy underwear. Okay, he had soft underwear. Common folk couldn't afford soft underwear, not in that culture. This guy, he spent his money on soft underwear and lived in luxury every day. And the phrase actually means he lived in good cheer. He feasted every day. He was a glutton. This guy, Jesus paints the picture of someone who really had all of this world's advantages. He paints the picture of someone who is completely self-absorbed with the wealth that he can buy himself anything he wants. But he's also completely indifferent to anything around him. And then in the next verse, in the NIV doesn't put it in, but in the original and some of the translations, you'll see the word but. But. The Bible uses the word but all the time to make a good contrast. Sometimes just go through and look at the buts in the Bible. Like Romans chapter 5, the Apostle Paul is talking about how sinful we are, but God demonstrates his love to us by sending his son. And so here's a but. We're going to have a contrast here. At this rich man's gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. Okay, notice the rich man isn't named, but the beggar is named. His name's Lazarus, Old Testament name of Eleazar, Old Testament name of Eleazar. It means God helps. He paints a picture of a guy in terrible circumstances. He said he was a beggar, and he was laid actually it means he was dropped. It's sometimes used, the idea of throwing something, okay? He can't even get around on his own, and so people just drop him at the rich man's gate, hoping the rich man will share something with him, longing to eat what falls from the table of the rich man. Back in this culture, people didn't eat at tables. You reclined on pillows on the floor or on the ground. But this guy, only the really, really wealthy ate at a table. This guy, he's that wealthy. He eats at a table. Oh, if I just have some of those crumbs. And he's so helpless that he can't even keep the dogs from coming and licking his sores. And remember, the writer of this, Luke, is a doctor. He uses a term there, a medical term for a skin disease with ulcers. Jesus paints the picture of complete contrast. This man is about as miserable as one can get. But death is the great equalizer. Time came that the beggar died, and angels carried him. He wasn't even buried. But angels took his soul to heaven. Took him to the side of Abraham. The rich man also died, and he was buried. And it must have been a marvelous funeral. Maybe these Pharisees, maybe some of them actually went to that funeral. It was such a big event. And in verse 23, in Hades, where he was in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He lifted up his eyes. That's a compound word that takes the word for eyes and lifted up together. It's the word from which we get the word ophthalmology today. An ophthalmologist is one who lifts up your eyes. He lifted up his eyes. With a dead man's eye, the rich man saw more clearly what was important. And now the rich man becomes the beggar. His request is very, very modest. Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replies, child, and it's actually the endearment word for a child. Child, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, there's a great chasm, a great gulf has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. At that, the rich man says, well, I beg you, send Lazarus back. I've got brothers. I've got 5 brothers. Let him warn them that they won't also come to this place of torment. And Abraham says, oh, hardness of heart is so bad that even if somebody came back from the dead, they won't listen to him. Remember, Jesus had a friend by the name of Lazarus, didn't he? What did Jesus do for his friend named Lazarus? He brought him back from the dead. In John chapter 11, he brought him back from the dead. In John chapter 12, you know, the Pharisees wanted to kill Lazarus. This guy that Jesus brought back from the dead, the Pharisees wanted to kill him. His name was Lazarus. Could this be a true story? It's not going to happen. We learned he says, no, Father Abraham, even if someone, they will repent. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. There's some lessons that we learn from this story of the rich man and Lazarus. First, we learn that people are conscious after death. They know what's going on around them. For good or for bad, they know what's going on around them. Secondly, people still have their identity. Their money and possessions are gone, but their character goes with them past the grave. Third, people still have their memories. Abraham said, child, remember. You still have your memories. C.S. Lewis has suggested that after death, with our memories, when we get to heaven, heaven is going to be so overwhelming, being in the presence of God, untainted by sin, that atmosphere is going to be so marvelous that it's going to wash all of our memories in such a way that we will feel like we've always been in heaven. He also says for those who don't go to heaven, that experience is going to be so hellish that it will wash all their memories and they will feel like they've always been in hell. The story also tells us there's 2 destinations. There's one destination of being blessed, and there's one destination of being in torment. And finally, this story tells us that with death, it's too late to change one's destiny. It's said at that point. Jesus told this story because the rich man saw more clearly with a dead man's eye. And Jesus wants us to understand spiritually so that we will see more clearly with a dead man's eye. My problem right now with my eye is that this current cornea that I have right now is 6 years old. And about a month and a half ago, my body has decided to reject my cornea. And so my ophthalmologist is trying to save this cornea so I don't have to go through that surgery again. And so he's got me on a really, really intensive regimen of steroid drops, trying to get my body to relax and accept this cornea, continue accepting this cornea. And so I asked him last Tuesday, I said, well, have you ever seen a cornea go this far and come back? He said, I have, but it's very, very rare. He said, we're probably going to have to transplant you again, but I'm not ready to give up on it. But the reality is right now with my right eye, I can only see shadows and outlines because my body has chosen to reject my cornea. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote his momentous book, Origin of the Species, and introduced the idea of natural selection, completely cutting off God from the picture and bringing the theory of evolution into our world. In Origin of the Species, Charles Darwin made this comment: to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances and for emitting different amounts of light and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I confess, absurd in the highest degree. Charles Darwin, in Origin of the Species, said, when you look at the human eye and all that it does, to think that it happened by natural selection is stupid. Who would ever think of such a thing? But in the very paragraph that he wrote that, he goes on to say, but I still think that's the way it happened. I still believe that the eye evolved through natural selection. He rejected the notion. With all the evidence of the human eye, he rejected the notion that God was the one who created this design. Yes, God gives us the ability to reject him. Remember, Harold Hazlitt once had a sermon on hell being the product of God's love. He said, God loves us enough that he allows us to reject him. He loves us that much. We can say no to him. And if we don't want to be with him, he will not make us be with him. And that's hell. God allows us to reject him. George Matheson was a few years younger than Charles Darwin's. Their careers overlapped. George Matheson was a Scottish preacher. He preached for 38 years. He preached for two different churches during those 38 years. One of them was a congregation of 2,000 people. He was a very popular preacher. He was so popular, in fact, Queen Victoria once invited him to preach at Balmoral Castle. He preached on Job. It was such a popular, she liked the sermon so much, she had the royal printers print up the sermon and distribute it throughout Britain. And George Matheson, in addition to being a preacher, was a philosopher and theologian. In 1884, he actually wrote a book in response to Darwin's Origin of the Species. He was an amazing, amazing scholar. He wrote 20 books on philosophy and theology, and he also wrote one volume of poetry. George Matheson was blind. In his early teens, he started losing his sight, and by the time he was 20 years old, he was completely blind. All he could see were just shadows and outlines. His younger sister went and learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew to be a reader for him for his studies. Wouldn't you like that if your kid, brother or sister learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew so you could do your homework? Okay. He was an amazing individual. But today we know him mainly because of one of the poems that he wrote. O love that wilt not let me go. Of this particular poem, George Matheson, later he wrote this about this poem. He said, "It was the night of my sister's marriage. The rest of the family were staying overnight in Glasgow. Something happened to me which was known only to myself and which caused me the most severe mental suffering. The hymn was the fruit of suffering. It was the quickest bit of work that I ever did in my life. I had the impression of having it dictated to me by some inward voice rather than of working it out myself. I am quite sure that the whole work was completed in 5 minutes and equally sure that it never received at my hand any retouch or correction." We don't know what George Matheson was referring to, but the suspicion is that he was referring to his blindness and a consequence of his blindness. In his late teens, George Matheson was engaged to be married. And when the doctors told him that there wasn't anything else they could do and that he would soon be completely blind, his fiancée said to him, "I cannot see my way clear to go through life bound by the chains of marriage to a blind man." And she broke off the engagement. In particular, notice the verse 2 up there where he says, "I yield my flickering torch to thee." Clearly a reference to his eyesight not being strong. George Matheson was blind physically. But when it came to his spiritual eyes, he saw 20/20. May we see spiritually with 20/20 vision. Andrew?
Oh, love that will not let me go, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I hold, that in thine ocean depths its flow may richer fuller be. O light that followest all my way, I yield my flickering torch to thee. My heart restores its borrowed ray, that in thy sunshine